The void above Decilium Prime split at 2000 hours local time, without warning and without precedent. The thing that fell through the fracture hit the upper atmosphere, trailing fire so bright it logged on the orbital sensor returns as a second sun making landfall. It was not a warp rift. The astropaths aboard the monitoring frigate Unyielding Contrition knew the signature of a warp breach well enough to have nightmares about it. And this was not that. No bilge reek of the imperium, no psychic pressure wave, no screaming from the navigator's sanctum. Just a geometric crack in real space, blazing with light no segmentum cartographer had assigned a color, and then sealing behind whatever fell from it like a wound closing over a shard of glass. On the eastern siege line of Hive Decilium's tertiary district, 300,000 Astra Militarum troopers were being killed. The World Eaters had arrived 12 hours before. 40 Chaos Space Marines of Khorne's most beloved legion, armored in brass and old blood, carrying the specific madness of the butcher's nails, bored into the space behind their eyes. They had broken the first defense line in 90 minutes, the second in 4 hours, the third in 7. By 2000 hours, they were through the rubble and cutting toward the command bunker at the center of the line, and the last regiment standing was down to its Lord Commissar, and 400 troopers, and a prayer that neither she nor they believed would work. The figure hit the ground between them and the World Eaters at a velocity that compressed the earth into a crater 5 meters deep. He came back to consciousness, face down in the mud. The smell hit him first. Blood and burning and something older underneath both, something that existed beneath sensation, an ambient wrongness in the air that had no DC equivalent and no word in any language he spoke. The warp had been pressing on this world for months since the Great Rift tore the sky of the galaxy open, and he felt it the way a man feels a sound in a room that stopped before he entered it. He filed it under unknown and focused on the immediate. Gravity, atmosphere, temperature. Gravity within 2% of Earth standard. Breathable atmosphere. The stars were wrong. Every constellation belonging to a sky no satellite had ever mapped for him. Above the cloud layer, yellow light pressed through the smoke and the debris haze of a 12-hour siege. His cells turned toward it, like a field toward rain. He was not depowered. He rose. 300,000 heartbeats in range, most at the elevated rhythm of prolonged terror. 40 separate biological signatures in powerplate, advancing in a wedge through the Astra Militarum line. Between them and the troopers, the abrupt silence of heartbeats stopping. Not metaphorically. Literally at a rate he could count, 43 in the last 90 seconds, each one a person who had been there and then was not. He moved toward them without making a decision about it. That was how it worked. The decision had already been made. A bolter round caught him across the jaw as he closed the final distance. Mass reactive casing, explosive tip, designed for power-armored targets, sparking off his skin and dropping into the mud. A ceramite gauntlet connected with his sternum at the full weight of a Chaos Space Marine at charge speed, the Marine's elbow joint inverted. The figure did not move backward. He noted the sensation and continued. He moved through the warband, the way weather moves through a place. Not with anger, not with effort. There was a sequence to it, the sequence a man follows when he has done this 10,000 times. Closest first, heavy weapons second, champion last. 29 of the 40 were down inside the first minute. 3 managed to fire at him again. The 33rd caught him with a demon-touched axe that left a mark on his forearm, hot in a way that was not quite pain, but was not nothing either. He noted this too. The 38th swung a siege hammer that rang off his shoulder and produced a sound the troopers 400 meters back could hear clearly. The champion was last. 4 meters of chaos-blessed physiology and a century of siege breaking and the butcher's nails driving him at the far edge of what a human mind can endure. He swung his chain axe with the weight of all that history, a blow that had split Lehman Russ tanks and broken 2 regiment commanders personally. The man in the blue cape caught the weapon in 2 fingers. The chain axe teeth screamed against his palm and accomplished nothing. He looked at the champion with the patient certainty of something that was not in danger, and threw him into the Chaos Rear Command bunker, hard enough that the structure's ferrocrete supports did not survive the contact. 90 seconds. 40 World Eaters. No guardsman lost after he landed. The Astra Militarum troopers did not cheer. 400 las carbines swung toward him in the silence. The Lord Commissar, a woman who had held this line for 12 hours, without raising her voice once during any of it, put the barrel of her bolt pistol against the back of his neck. Her voice was flat and professional and gave nothing away. Identify yourself. What manner of Xenos are you? Are you a servant of the ruinous powers? He turned. The bolt pistol tracked his throat. He looked at the weapon and then at the woman holding it. He had the time to consider what he was looking at. Someone who had been afraid for 12 hours and had not let it touch her work, who was currently aiming at the back of his skull with the certainty that this was the correct professional response to an unknown variable in a war zone. He found he respected this. He said his name. She had not heard it. There was no record on Desalium Prime that contained it, and no reasonable mechanism by which there would have been. Clark Kent, he said from somewhere else. She did not put the bolt pistol away. He turned from her and moved toward the wounded, because the wounded were the immediate problem, and the bolt pistol was simply no longer the most pressing variable. He lifted a ferrocrete slab off a man who had been under it for 40 minutes. He pressed his fingers against a shrapnel wound and held pressure until the trooper's blood stopped moving toward the outside. The commissar watched him work. The thing that had ended 40 Chaos Space Marines, in the time it took her to count them, was on its hands and knees in the mud, keeping a wounded trooper alive, applying the focused attention of someone who had decided this was the most important thing happening on the planet. She had met a great many things that called themselves allies in 32 years of Imperial service. She holstered the bolt pistol. She did not lower her guard. "Secure the perimeter," she said to the troopers behind her, "and get me a Vox line to Segmentum Command." She did not yet know what she was going to say. High above the siege line, in the signal room of the frigate Unyielding Contrition Holding Station at high anchor above Desalium Prime, the ship's astropath went rigid at her station. Her eyes, blind since the soul binding, found nothing. Her hands locked on the transmission altar. The sound that came from her was not a sound that traveled through air. It moved through the warp and rang off the inner walls of the Imperium and reached every astropath within 4-star systems as a single sustained note of wrongness. She knew demon incursions, rogue psyker emergence, the specific nauseating texture of Genstealer Kulturstalt rising in the deep hive. She did not know this. The thing on the surface had no presence in the Imperium at all. No soul shadow, no psychic echo, no signature of any kind, a shape in real space, with no reflection in the sea of souls. The warp did not know what it was. It had just stopped a World Eaters warband, and the warp did not know what it was, and that was the most alarming piece of information she had transmitted in 11 years of service. The message was composing itself already, degraded by the cicatrix maledictum's ambient interference, imprecise with distance. It would arrive in 5 days, distorted and fragmented. But it would arrive. Something has landed. No category. Unknown. Real quick, before we go any further into this, who is the next character you are dying to see walk into a universe that has absolutely no idea what is coming for it? Drop a name in the comments. I read every single one. The astropathic garble reached 3 separate Amasec rooms across the segmentum obscurus within the same hour, degraded by the cicatrix maledictum's interference, but legible enough at its center. Wids. In the first room, aboard an Ordo, Xenos Inquisitors frigate, 2 systems from Desalium Prime, a lean woman with 17 years of alien threat cataloging behind her, read the relay twice and set her recaf aside. Alien asset, she noted in her personal cipher, or alien threat. The distinction mattered, and she did not yet have the information to draw it. She issued a transit order. In the second room, in the lower decks of a Malleus Puritan's black ship passing through the outer system, an older man who had spent 4 decades studying things that were not demonic, but were not human, either read the same relay with different eyes. Demonic mimicry, he thought, or genuine anomaly. Either possibility was worse than the other, in a different way. He changed his heading. In the third room, in the command center of a Space Marine chapter, Homeworld 2, Systems to the Galactic East, a chapter master finished the relay and set it face down on the table. Dispatch a full company to Desalium Prime, he said. Assess and contain. He did not say neutralize. He kept that option in reserve, filed under contingencies he hoped he would not need. All 3 were moving within the hour. The Imperium's machinery had not turned this fast for a single unclassified target in living memory. 12 hours after the alien fell through the fracture, he was still on the siege line. The guardsmen had pulled back from the fortified perimeter they had spent 3 weeks constructing, and were watching from behind it while the man in the cape worked through the aftermath of the World Eater's incursion. Pulling survivors out of rubble, carrying the badly wounded to the Medicae stations on his back at a pace no stretcher-bearer could match, working without asking permission and without pausing to eat or rest or explain himself. And the Lord Commissar had stopped trying to maintain a cordon around him because cordons required the willingness of the contained party to remain within them, and he did not. The Thunderhawks came in at dawn, low and fast, dropping a full Space Marine company in parade formation across the cleared center of the siege line. 100 Adeptus Astartes, weapons at port arms, landing in precise columns in the dust and the dried blood. Their captain walked forward alone with a storm bolter raised and his voxcaster set to broadcast across all channels. Exonous entity. You will identify yourself, submit to restraint, and await formal classification. Failure to comply designates you a hostile. The alien looked up from the trooper he was carrying. He set the man down carefully, straightened, and looked at the storm bolter, then at the captain. 200 years of service had shaped that captain into a precise and lethal instrument, and what looked back at him from those eyes was not fear, not aggression, not the calculating contempt of something preparing to fight. It was patient consideration, the expression of something that had assessed the situation and reached a conclusion the captain had not been included in. The captain fired anyway because his orders were clear, and he was Adeptus Astartes, a full storm bolter magazine, point blank into the alien's chest. The round sparked off the blue fabric and fell into the mud. The man in the cape did not step back. He looked down at the spent casings, then back at the captain with the same expression. "I'm not going to fight you," he said, "but I'm also not going to stop helping people. Those two things can both be true at once. The captain had killed orc war bosses and greater daemons and a renegade chapter master whose genseed had curdled a century before anyone noticed. In 200 years of war, he had never had a Xenos speak to him like that. Not with disdain, not with hate, not with the contempt of a being that knows it is winning. With the patient certainty that the captain was not a threat, and the quiet implication that once the captain had finished processing what had just happened, he would arrive at the same conclusion on his own. Something shifted in his internal model of the universe. He would spend the next several weeks not admitting this. He lowered the Stormbolter. He opened his Voxcaster. Stormbolter, ammunition had 0 effect, he said to his captain adjutant. Mark it and transmit to all relevant command levels, every word. The Ordo Xenos Inquisitor's frigate reached Desilium Prime's orbit 8 hours later. She came down in a Valkyrie with 4 members of her retinue, a Death Watch veteran whose chapter marking she had learned not to ask about, 2 acolytes carrying data slates, and an astropath, old and carefully maintained, who had been reading the psychic field since before the Inquisitor was born. She did not come with a weapon drawn, she came with a question. Tell me what you are, she said, when she had crossed the distance to where he was working. He told her. She had no category for the answer. She had heard stranger things in 70 years of inquisitorial service, but she had not heard them described this way from the perspective of a being that appeared to have no particular relationship with the concept of being strange. She nodded to her astropath, who reached toward the alien's presence in the psychic field, probing gently, the way an old man reaches into dark water. He withdrew almost immediately. He spoke at a murmur close to the Inquisitor's ear. No warp presence, he said. None at all. Not suppressed, not masked, simply absent. No soul signature the imperium can locate or read. It is not a psyker. It is not a demon. It is not mimicking either. It is something for which the warp has no category. She accepted this without visible reaction and wrote 2 words in her field log. Unknown, not hostile. She would expand on both later. The Space Marine captain's report traveled upward through the chain faster than was standard, because the content was the kind of thing that warranted flagging at every level. Chapter Master to Segmentum command. Then, because the chapter master was the kind of officer who knew when something exceeded the available taxonomies. Directly to the office of the Lord Commander of the Imperium, Robuti Gilliman read 1 line and set the report down. His equerry, who had spent 9 years learning to read the spaces between the Primarch's reactions, noted that the Lord Commander did not speak for 90 seconds after setting it down. For a man who processed operational intelligence at the speed of a Strategos engine and issued responses in kind, 90 seconds was not a pause. His personal record had no equivalent for it. When Gilliman spoke, he issued 1 instruction. Bring him to me, he said. Not an order to the alien, an invitation through the Inquisitor. If he is willing to come, do not attempt to compel it. His equerry, who had learned not to ask why, filed the instruction and transmitted it within the minute. Clark Kent did not refuse. He had no map of this galaxy, no knowledge of its factions or its history, no allies and no way home, and no particular plan beyond the one he had been executing since he landed. He had been here less than a day and had already identified 2 facts that mattered. The first was that the worst things in this galaxy were different in kind from the worst things he had encountered before, different in a way his cells registered as wrongness below the level of thought. The second was that he did not yet understand enough to act well, and not understanding enough to act well was a reason to gather information, not to move. The Inquisitor explained the invitation, the most powerful human empire in the known galaxy, and the man who ran it. "I'd like to understand where I am before I decide what to do about it," he said. She studied him for a moment, an alien entity that no weapon in the Imperial arsenal had been able to stop, requesting information before acting on it. She wrote a third word in her field log under the thirst to careful. She was not yet sure if that was comforting or not. The transit dropped the Inquisitor's frigate into real space above a world that was already losing. Hive Secundus occupied the northern continent of an agri-world that had been converted to secondary manufacturing over 3 centuries, its spires rising out of what had once been grain plains with the architectural ambition of people who had long since forgotten what grain was. It was a tertiary, strategic objective. It was not supposed to be a front line. The World Eaters operating on its outer ring had not been informed of either of these facts. 72 hours. That was how long the Second Warband had been working through the city's outer defensive ring, coordinated, brutal, and patient, in the particular way that things driven by the butcher's nails could occasionally be patient, the hunger focusing their advance rather than scattering it. The Space Marine Company defending it had been slowing the assault at ruinous cost. The same captain who had faced the alien on Decilium Prime 2 days ago was commanding here now, working from a bombed-out hab block, running his 30-second operational update of the rotation. He had lost 31 Marines in 3 days. 3 days of holding a line that should have required an entire chapter. 31 brothers against 90 Chaos Space Marines, the Chaos Lord whose Cornat mutations had given him the mass of a dreadnought, and the temperament of something that had never in its existence learned what a wall was for. The Inquisitor was reviewing approach vectors in the frigate's signal room when she noticed the alien was no longer standing behind her. He had gone while she was still composing the thought. From the frigate's altitude, the assessment had taken him less than 4 seconds. Breach points in the outer ring, position of maximum pressure, count of the World Eater's advance, rate of casualty accrual among the guardsmen in the interior line, transit time of a Valkyrie from orbit to surface versus the rate at which people were dying. He dropped from the frigate bay at 40 kilometers altitude and did not slow until the ground required it. The captains or specs registered an incoming object at terminal velocity. No drop pod profile, no imperial transponder. He looked up from his tactical display and through the slit of the command post viewport and saw what fell through the ash cloud above the outer ring's breach point and recognized it and said nothing. The impact shook the command post on its foundations. The World Eater's assault wave had 90 Marines in it, advancing in a wedge formation. The captain's remaining 60 had been unable to break for 3 days. He was watching through the viewport when the figure moved into it, 90 seconds. That was how long it took. The captain timed it by instinct, the same way a warrior of 200 years times everything that matters, because knowing how long things take is how you survive long enough to be a warrior of 200 years. He watched the man who had come down from the frigate move through the assault wave the way fire moves through a dry place, without hesitation, without pause, without the microsecond assessments that every Space Marine makes in combat, because every Space Marine has learned that hesitation is survivable, but overextension is not. He did not hesitate. He did not overextend. He simply moved, and where he moved, things stopped being problems. 20 World Eaters in the first 30 seconds, scattered into the rubble of the hab blocks they had spent 3 days clearing. The Chaos Lord saw the figure coming and did the thing a Chaos Lord of his particular lineage always did, which was charge. He swung his chain axe, a demon-touched weapon that had caved in a Baneblade's glacis plate on Cataris Vizii, carrying every gram of his mutated mass, and the butcher's nails accumulated fury behind it. The axe connected with the visitor's left forearm. Something happened that was not quite a block and not quite an absorption. The blow landed. The weapon's warp edge left a mark on the skin beneath the blue fabric, mark that glowed briefly the color of heat before it began to fade. Not a wound in the way the captain understood wounds. A notation. An entry in a catalogue of things that registered differently from the others. The visitor absorbed the strike's momentum without losing a step, turned it, and returned a single counterstrike to the Chaos Lord's center mass. The Lord went through 2 ferrocrete blast walls. He went through the ruins of a World Eater's command bunker. He did not get up before the assault was over. 90 seconds, 90 World Eaters incapacitated or scattered. The assault line, which the captain's 60 surviving Marines had not been able to break in 72 hours of attrition, broken. The captain watched his tactical display update in real time. He had killed an Orc war boss on Regantus IV. He had held a trench against Tyrannid assault for 11 days on Fenrath's world. He had watched the greatest warriors his chapter produced perform feats that ordinary soldiers would have filed under impossible, and he had called those feats routine, because 200 years had taught him that the ceiling on possible was always higher than you thought it was. He had never seen anything do what he had just watched happen. He opened a Vox channel to his chapter master. "We cannot hold him," he said, 4 words. He closed the channel. His chapter master, receiving the report 12 minutes later, filed it under Gilliman's standing priority request. All contact data, all observations, all designations, continuously and directly, without editorial and without delay. The Inquisitor reached the surface 20 minutes after the alien had. She found him in the wreckage of the assault wave's forward line, standing with his left arm held at a slight angle, studying the underside of his own forearm with the careful attention of someone running diagnostics on a system they had not previously had reason to monitor. The mark was almost gone. The cells had already closed it down to a trace the color of an old bruise, and even that was fading as she watched. But he had noticed it, and the fact that he had noticed it was, she was beginning to understand, the thing about him that mattered most. "The axe the Lord was carrying," he said. "The others don't register. That one did." She had watched a man process 72 hours of siege in 90 seconds, and then immediately begin auditing his own vulnerabilities. She found this more unsettling than the 90 seconds. "Warp energy," she said. "The diamond touch on the weapon. It is not a physical edge. It is something the imperium puts into blessed weapons and corrupted instruments, something older than the metal." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him cataloguing the information. "Is everything you fight here carrying that?" It was not the question of someone afraid of the answer. It was the question of someone who needed accurate information to make accurate decisions. "The thing's worth fighting," she said. "Yes." He lowered his arm. He looked at the breach in the outer ring, and then at the surviving guardsmen emerging from the interior positions to assess the silence, and she noted the order in which his attention moved. Not the dead World Eaters, not the structural damage to the outer ring, not the tactical situation, the guardsmen, the living ones, and what their faces were doing. The civilians came out of the underhive shelters an hour later, when the guardsmen had confirmed the outer ring secure. They came up through the access shafts and the drainage culverts and the cracked foundations of the lower hab blocks into the light of a day that had not seemed likely to still be theirs as of this morning. They moved through the wreckage of the assault wave slowly at first, and then less slowly because the large figure standing in the center of it was not moving toward them and was watching them with an expression that did not belong in this city. an expression that carried something their faces had stopped, being able to hold 3 days into a siege that was supposed to kill them. A child reached out and touched the symbol on his chest. He looked down. For the first time since the fracture dropped him into this galaxy, he smiled. Not the contained expression of someone managing a situation, a real one. The Inquisitor, watching from the captain's command post, did not write what she was thinking. She wrote what she would be able to defend to a review board. Dangerous. Not hostile. She closed her field log and looked at the captain. Segmentum Command is going to want an updated threat assessment, he said. I know, she said. I don't have a category for it yet. What are you going to tell them? She watched the alien crouch down to say something to the child at eye level, in a language the child almost certainly did not speak. The child smiled back anyway. The truth, she said, that the category doesn't exist yet. The Ordinarius Inquisitor's shuttle touched down on Hive Secundus's primary landing platform 2 hours after dawn, and the man who stepped from it did not look at the ruined city. He had seen ruined cities. He brought 3 assets. The Xenos Inquisitor had not: a sanctioned Psyker of Gamma classification, soul-bound to the Emperor in a binding ceremony that most candidates did not survive. A Culexus assassin of the Officio Assassinorum, a living animus speculum, whose mere presence disrupted the warp field in a 40-meter radius, and whose anti-psychic aura made experienced psychers visibly ill. And 41 years of accumulated conviction that anything carrying this much power and this convincing an argument for its own benevolence was working harder than an honest threat needed to work. He had spent 4 decades studying things that claimed not to be what they were. They were always what they were. He did not come to talk. The alien was standing in the open center of the assault wave's former forward position, speaking to a guardsman who could not possibly have understood him and was trying anyway. The Xenos Inquisitor stood 20 meters back, watching with the expression of someone who had been managing a situation longer than she would have preferred. The Malleus Inquisitor noted the expression and did not adjust his approach on the basis of it. "Stand clear," he said to her. She moved to one side. He positioned his Gamma Psyker 12 meters from the alien and waited until the Culexus's anti-psychic field had settled into its suppression radius. The Psyker at the center of that field moved uncomfortably, because the Culexus's null aura was as effective against the sanctioned Psyker's reach as it was against any other connection to the Imperium. The irony of bringing a tool that hampered his own asset was not lost on the Malleus Inquisitor. He had brought it to disrupt whatever psychic field the alien was generating. The alien, he noted, appeared unaffected. The aura found nothing in that direction to disrupt. He filed that. He nodded once to the Psyker. The gamma grade reached into the warp with the care of someone who knew the source of the heat was not interested in whether they burned. He channeled a bolt of raw psychic force, compressed and focused, aimed at the center of the figure's chest. The alien staggered. 1 step backward, involuntary and visible, and then a half-second pause in which his expression shifted from open attention to something more concentrated. His vision, blurred for a fraction of a second, visible in the way the muscles around the eyes changed. Then he recovered. 3 seconds. He straightened. That, Clark Kent said, was different. The Malleus Inquisitor had not moved his eyes from the target since the bolt struck. What he noted was not the damage, which was minor. What he noted was the recovery, which was faster than any conventional wound had produced in anything he had studied in 41 years. And the word the alien had used, different, implied a prior category. A prior category implied that the alien was already running a classification system, for the kinds of harm this galaxy could produce, and that this was the first one to fit a new column. The Gamma Psyker withdrew from the warp and found that he was shaking. Not from the effort. He could sustain that output for another hour at minimum. He was shaking because of what he had reached toward and not found. There was no warp presence in the direction of that figure, no soul signature, no psychic echo of any kind, no residue. Reaching toward it through the imperium was like reaching for something standing on the other side of a wall that had no other side. The warp did not know that direction existed. He gave his report in a murmur while the alien waited with the careful attention of someone who had concluded that making the moment more difficult would produce no useful result. The Malleus Inquisitor issued his containment order. Kal-El did not comply. He remained where he was and looked at the Inquisitor with the expression the Space Marine captain had noted in his report, patient. The certainty of something that had assessed the room and reached a conclusion without hostility. "I'm not a threat to your people," he said, "and I'm not going to sit in a cell while your people are dying. Both of those things are going to keep being true." He paused, choosing the next sentence with the care of someone who had learned that the words available to him were not always the words the situation required. "I don't know what authority you're invoking. I don't have a framework for it. You should factor that in. The Malleus Inquisitor invoked the seal of the Holy Ordos. He had invoked it before planetary governors, fleet admirals, and twice before chapter masters who outranked him by every measure except the one that counted. The seal of the Holy Ordos was the highest operational authority in the Imperium of Man, below the throne of terror. The alien's expression did not change. Not from defiance. He was, as he had said, working within a framework in which that seal was not a real thing, because being a real thing required 10,000 years of institutional weight, and the man in front of him had been here for 4 days. The Malleus Inquisitor had, in 41 years, never had his authority failed to produce an effect for that particular reason. The Xenos Inquisitor stepped in. She did not argue ideology. She laid out the mathematics the way you'd lay out a logistics assessment. The alien had stopped 90 World Eaters in 90 seconds. It could not be contained by any weapon in the Imperial arsenal and had demonstrated this twice in 4 days. The Imperium was losing worlds at a rate that did not leave 3 weeks available for a containment attempt against an asset that had shown no interest in containment. The Ordo Malleus could run its audit. If it found chaos taint, it could act accordingly. If it found nothing, the asset went to Guilliman, and the Malleus Inquisitor wrote a report that would make him famous in inquisitorial circles for the next century. The Malleus Inquisitor agreed to the audit. He did not agree because he was convinced. He agreed because she was right about the mathematics. The Ordo Hereticus Witch Hunter arrived within the day with 6 Sisters of Battle, forming a sanctified perimeter and the full suite of spiritual assessment instruments. The audit ran 8 hours. Her verdict was precise and left everyone in the room with less than they wanted. No demonic taint, no warp corruption, no psychic mutation, no evidence of chaos worship, direct or indirect, no imperium-sourced contamination of any kind. The alien's spiritual profile was entirely outside imperial categorization. It was alien. It was anomalous. Whatever it was clean. The Malleus Inquisitor filed his report under pending review and departed. 3 inquisitorial lords would be arguing about it within the month. He marked it as likely to continue for years. While the Inquisitors finished their conference, the Xenos Inquisitor sat with the alien in what had been the Outer Ring's Medicae station and told him about the Imperium. She did it efficiently, without pause for reaction, because in her experience, the people who needed time to react during an explanation were the people who were going to make the situation worse. The parallel dimension of pure psychic energy, the galaxy's background radiation, present since before recorded civilization, the thing that fed on collective emotion and had been doing it for as long as there were minds to feel things. What it produced, entities of sufficient scale to shape history, sustained by what people felt and wanted and feared, indifferent to consent. She told him what hope generated in that environment. Superman listened without interrupting. His hands were at rest. He had the listening posture of someone who had learned that interrupting people mid-sentence was a way of arriving at the end of a conversation with less information than you needed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "So when I saved those people," he said, "on Desilium Prime, on Secundus, every time you generated a warp disturbance consistent with a large psychic positive event," she said. "Yes." She did not say the name of the entity that catalogued events of that emotional signature. She did not need to. She watched his face while he worked it out. It did not fall. That was the thing she had not anticipated and would not forget. He heard it and processed it, and his face moved through something, and what came out the other side was not despair. His eyes stayed level. Something in his jaw changed for a moment, and then settled. He was quiet for longer this time. Then he said, "That changes what I'm doing. It doesn't change what I'm doing." She had no answer for that. She was not sure one existed. She made a note of it anyway. The data relay arrived at Belisarius Kull's primary analytical node 14 days after the initial astropathic burst, degraded by the cicatrix maledictum's interference, but complete enough for his 17 secondary processing cores to reconstruct its essential content. He had been recalibrating the Primaris gene seed sequencing protocols for a chapter. He was not officially permitted to be improving when the relay interrupted him. He set the sequencing aside. The biological summary was, in the technical vocabulary, he had spent 10,000 years expanding extraordinary, a life form of entirely unknown xenotype, physically superior to an Adeptus Custodes by documented combat output, powered by stellar radiation through a biological mechanism that had no Mechanicus analog and violated several working assumptions his research had treated as settled for 8 centuries. Partially vulnerable to warp energy in a way that mirrored no known species, no soul signature of any kind, muff, present in this galaxy as the result of what appeared to be an inter-universal transit event, which was not a sentence Call had expected to write in any of his 10,000 years of notes. But here it was. He dispatched an explorator vessel to track the subject's location and filed the biological packet under Priority Aquila, the designation he reserved for data bearing directly on the question occupying at least 3 of his processing cores since he had finished resurrecting Guilliman, the Golden Throne. Its mechanisms were degrading. The current compensatory input, 1,000 psychers per day, was not sufficient to offset the decay rate. He had 17 active theories about alternative energetic inputs. This life form's stellar radiation biology had just become the 18th, and the most interesting data the Explorator Division had produced in longer than he was willing to calculate. He made a note and returned to the gene sequencing. Call had learned, across 10,000 years, to be patient with interesting things. The transit to Hector Minoris took 11 hours in the warp, a journey the aliens spent in the frigate's observation bay studying the exterior of the warp window with the focused attention of someone cataloging a threat they had not yet named. The Xeno's Inquisitor found him there when she came to brief him on the next stop. Hector Minoris, a mid-sized hive world. Population 400 million. 40 years of genteel cult infestation, operating across 12 hive districts with the patient. Generational efficiency of a species that understood the real infiltration was biological, not tactical. 6 of the 12 districts were compromised at control structure level. The cult's gene seed was in the water filtration, the food distribution chains, the Planetary Defense Force command hierarchy, and the planetary governor's household. The other 6 were contaminated at lower saturation. The hive mind, probing the outer system from a distance the frigate's sensors could not yet resolve, was already responding to the beacon the cult's presence generated. The Inquisitor had the authority to order exterminatus. She had exercised it before. She transmitted the firing authorization at 0400 hours local in a voice that had done this before, and the cyclonic torpedo platform that had been holding station above the planet for 3 weeks received the command and began its acquisition sequence. Superman was in orbit. He had been scanning the planet's surface for 2 hours. He had heard 400 million heartbeats. He had heard the cult cells moving in the compromised districts, at the particular rhythm of people doing what they were built to do in the dark. He had heard, in the 6 most contaminated sectors, the ordinary sounds of ordinary lives being lived by people who had been changed and did not know it and were sleeping or working or putting children to bed. He saw the torpedo lock acquire. He moved. The intercept happened 20 kilometers above the atmosphere. He held the cyclonic casing in both hands and burned through it with heat vision at an intensity that converted the device's core to plasma before the detonation sequence could complete. The yield was sufficient to crack the crust of a small moon. The light above Hector Minoris was, for 11 seconds, the brightest object in the system. When it cleared, the planet was intact. He came back to the frigate with the edges of his cape scorched, and an expression she had not seen from him before. Not anger, not satisfaction, the expression of someone who had arrived at the end of a decision. She said, "Sit down." He did. She told him about genestealer cults. Not as a lesson, but as an assessment, what a compromised population meant to the hive mind's approach vector, what the cult's biological beacon generated in terms of tyrannid response time, what the cascade projection looked like for an untreated world with 6 districts at the saturation level she had documented on Hector Minoris. She gave him the numbers. 400 million now. 80 billion later, minimum, across the surrounding systems, once a hive fleet followed the beacon to its source and began the consumption sequence that the tyrannid hive mind had been running on occupied worlds since before the imperium existed. Clark Kent listened to every word. Then, "I'm not doing the math." She had expected this. She had encountered 3 alien species and 1 rogue artificial intelligence over 30 years of service that had made a version of this argument. The argument was always the same shape. The math is wrong, the math is cold, the math removes something essential from the calculation. She had answered it in various forms 47 times. "I have made this call 47 times, she said. 30 years. Each time I was right by every operational metric the Ordo possesses. Each time I lived with what right costs." He was quiet. "How do you know this is the right call?" he said, "and not the easy one?" "Because the easy call is to not make it," she said. "To leave. To let someone else authorize it. To decide that 400 million lives are too many to have on your conscience, and hand the problem to the next Inquisitor and the next fleet and the next world that goes dark when the hive fleet arrives. The hard call is to be the one responsible for those 400 million and still authorize it, because the alternative is being responsible for 80 billion. He said, "Give me 72 hours. She accepted because she was professional enough to update the calculus when a resource was available that changed it. She set conditions. If the cult's operational structure was not verifiably broken in 72 hours, she fired. He agreed. He went in 63 minutes after the conversation ended. He was faster than any cult network had been built to account for, because cult networks were built for human speed infiltration, and he was not operating at human speed. He moved through the compromised districts, following the biology rather than the intelligence, because he could hear the difference between a body that had been changed and one that had not. He located the genetic seed distribution chains. He found the command structures. He neutralized the cult's operational network across all 6 compromised districts in 68 hours. He contacted the Inquisitor at the 68-hour mark. She fired anyway, 1 district. The easternmost of the 6 compromised sectors, where the contamination ran into the water table at a depth that 68 hours of manual work could not verify as cleared to her operational standard. A single orbital strike, surgical by exterminatus standards. 2 million people. Kal-El was in orbit when it fell. He watched it. He did not stop it. He had agreed to the compromise, and the compromise included the Inquisitor's operational standard, and her operational standard was the product of 30 years and 47 calls she could still enumerate by location and date and casualty count. He had agreed. The strike was what he had agreed to. The light came and went in 4 seconds. He stayed in orbit after. He was still there an hour later when the frigate's positioning confirmed they needed to move. The Inquisitor, monitoring the observation bay through the frigate's internal sensors, did not move to retrieve him. She waited until he came back on his own. He did not speak when he returned to the signal room. She did not speak either, because there was nothing she could say that would be more honest than the silence, and she had learned a long time ago that filling silence with words was the way you made yourself feel better, rather than the way you helped someone else carry what they were carrying. She filed her incident report. Under outcome, she wrote, "Partial clearance achieved. 1 district struck for confirmed contamination." Under asset performance, she wrote 6 words. He stayed for the whole thing. It was not a compliment, and it was not a condemnation. It was the most accurate thing she knew how to record. The frigate's astropaths felt it before the sensors did, a presence at the edge of the warp boundary, not attacking, not pressing, simply there in the way a stone in a river is, simply there present where the current runs, changing the current's shape without effort or intention. The Xenos Inquisitor went to battle stations on reflex. Her Death Watch veteran came forward with a bolter leveled. Her 2 acolytes sealed the signal room. Her astropath went very still in the posture of someone listening to something too large to fit in ordinary hearing. Then she saw who it was. "Stand down," she said. Eldrad Althran did not require an invitation. He had walked the webway for 10,000 years and had visited vessels of 17 different fleet classifications and had never once waited to be announced. He came through the frigate's hull in the way Farseers come through things, not by breaking them, but by being present on the other side. Before the matter of transit became an obstacle, he was in the signal room. The Death Watch veteran took 1 step backward and held his position. The Farseer of Craftworld, Ulthwé, wore the blackened bone of his people and the war mask of a seer who had watched too many futures converge to be surprised by the sight of an armed Imperial frigate in the dark between stars. He looked at the Inquisitor once, with the measured patience of something that had known her predecessors, and then he looked at the alien. He spoke in Low Gothic because he had had 10,000 years to learn every language a conversation might require. "I am not here for them," he said. "I am here for you." He did not name Superman. He did not cite his rank or origin or the symbol on his chest. He told him what he was in the Eldari way by his nature. A being of solar energy, carrying no warp presence the imperium could find or read, built around a psychology structured entirely on a concept this galaxy's most powerful entities had spent 10,000 years learning to use. He said it without heat and without sympathy. He said it the way you describe the structural condition of a building to someone you have watched move into it. Then he told him about the Eldari. He selected the piece the argument required. Once his people had been the galaxy's dominant civilization, ancient, refined, capable of things the imperium of man would not approach for another 10 millennia. They had not been destroyed from without. They had not been betrayed. They had felt too much for too long, in too many ways. And the accumulated weight of that feeling in the warp had eventually become a consciousness, born not from what his people chose to do, but from what they felt while doing it, their desire made manifest, their excess given teeth and appetite, and no interest whatsoever in the civilization that had produced it. The Chaos Gods are not external to this galaxy, Eldrad said. They are this galaxy. They are what every mortal mind that has ever felt rage, or fear, or hope, or despair has contributed to. They are the weight of every feeling the 50 billion people who died in the last 3 years of this war had, and every feeling the 5 trillion before them had, accumulated over the full span of recorded history into entities that will exist for as long as mortal creatures continue to feel things. They cannot be destroyed. They cannot be negotiated with. They are not persons. They are the galaxy looking at itself. Superman said nothing. He was listening with the attention of someone who had learned that information was a tool, and that interrupting people mid-sentence was a way of arriving at the end of a conversation with less of it. Eldrad said, "Tzeentch has already noticed you. He let that land. You walked into this galaxy, carrying a concept so pure and so absolute that the Changer of Ways catalogued it in the first hour of your arrival. Every soul you save emits a warp event with hope's specific frequency. Every person who looks at the mark on your chest and thinks, for one moment, that things might be better is generating a signal the architect of fate receives as clearly as you receive sunlight. You are not fighting Tzeentch. You are farming for him." Superman said, "Then what is the alternative? I stop helping people. I stop believing things can be better. I become exactly what this galaxy already has too much of. Another powerful being who decided the math did not work out in favor of trying." Eldrad tilted his head in the way of someone who had heard this argument in every shape it could take across 10,000 years of consideration and found it was always the same argument. "I am not here to argue the alternative," he said. "I am here to ensure you understand the cost before you incur it further." He paused, the last being to believe that hope could hold this galaxy together is dying on a golden chair in the center of the empire he built. His hope cost him everything he had. It accomplished exactly half of what he intended. You should know that before you decide what you are doing here. The signal room was very quiet. Eldrad spoke one more thing before he withdrew. He said it with the flatness of someone who had tried across a very long life to use this specific information and had found it partially useful at great expense and wanted to be precise about what it was worth. You cannot punch a god out of existence. You cannot inspire one into surrender. What you can do, if you are fortunate and precise enough, is deny it the specific emotion it requires for long enough, in a narrow enough place, that something else survives. He said it with the weariness of something that had tried this and partially failed for 10 millennia, That is the only play this board has. Then he was gone in the way farciers go present, and then not. The point of transit irrelevant by the time anyone thought to look for it. Superman stood at the signal room's viewport. The stars outside were yellow, most of them. His cells turned toward them by property rather than decision, the way a compass needle turns toward north. He let Eldrad's accounting run through his mind without trying to stop it. Every fight he had won since the fracture. Every life he had saved. Every warp disturbance those saved lives had generated in the imperium, carrying hope's signature into the psychic sea that was also apparently the source of everything in this galaxy worth being afraid of. He thought about the Inquisitor's 47 calls. He thought about 2 million people in one hive district and the way the light from the orbital strike came and went in 4 seconds, and he had stood in orbit and not stopped it because he had agreed to the compromise, and the compromise was what it was. He thought about the Emperor on a throne. He thought about the glyph on his chest, and what it meant, and whether it meant the same thing in this galaxy as it did in the one he came from. He did not have an answer yet. He kept standing. The world's void shields were still active when the daemons came through them. That was the first indication the incursion was not operating by ordinary chaos logic, which was largely the logic of overwhelming force, applied without pretense of coordination. The blue horrors and the flamers did not press against the shields and burn through. They arrived inside them, present on the surface of Vantis Secundus in quantities that bypassed the defensive perimeter entirely, because they had not been located anywhere until the moment they appeared inside it. The warp did not carry them through the shields. The warp simply reinterpreted their position. The Astra Militarum mechanized regiment defending the primary hive had been fighting for 6 hours when the frigate dropped out of transit above the system. The regiment's Lehman Russ squadrons had lost 11 tanks. The Sisters of the Order of the Valorous Heart were holding the cathedral quarter at the center of the hive with the ferocity of women for whom retreat was not tactically inadvisable, but cosmologically impermissible, and they were doing it at a rate that would put them below half strength by morning. The incursion's pattern was wrong in ways that experienced officers noticed without being able to articulate precisely, which was the kind of wrongness that experienced officers had learned to treat as a category of threat in itself. The incursion had been designed around a route, around a specific approach vector and a specific asset, and a very patient intelligence that had studied both. The visitor was in the signal room when the tactical picture assembled itself from the planet's emergency Vox traffic. He was already scanning the surface by the time the Inquisitor finished the first situation report. He dropped from the frigate bay before she finished the second. He hit the incursion's forward line at a velocity that scattered the leading blue horrors across a manufacturing district, and drove back the flamers at the center with heat vision intense enough to dissolve the psychic matter, anchoring them in real space. 24 daemons banished in the first 90 seconds. The pressure on the regiment's left flank dropped by a third. For 5 minutes it looked like the problem had a solution. Then he saw the first of them reform. At the edges of the engagement area where he had driven the initial wave back into the warp, things were pressing back through. The same blue horrors reconstituted in the immaterium and re-emerging through warp seams that had not existed when he closed them. New rifts opening in the spaces he had just cleared, he destroyed them again, more opened. He destroyed those. The replacements were already forming. He was not fighting an army, he was fighting a tide, and the tide had a source he could not reach by hitting the water. The flamers found him on his third pass through the forward line. Their warp fire was not the fire of combustion. It was the warp's emotion-given thermal shape, and it hit him the way the sanctioned Psyker's boat had hit him on Secundus. Not crippling, not immediately catastrophic, but registering in a way that the World Eater's weapons had not. Each hit was minor. They were not coming from one source. They were coming from dozens of sources simultaneously, and the hits were accumulating the way debt accumulates. Each one survivable, the aggregate a different category of problem. The system's stellar radiation was keeping his cellular repair active. He was winning every individual exchange. He was losing ground in the aggregate, and he knew it. He noted this and continued. The Lord of Change manifested at the center of the incursion while he was pulling a battle sister from the rubble of the cathedral's outer wall. He felt the warp shift before the demon fully arrived, a change in the ambient psychic pressure, the way a room changes before something very large and very patient enters it. He set the sister down and looked toward the source. The demon was vast, avian in structure, shifting at its edges in the way that sentient entities shift, as though the final decision about what it was had not been made and was being continuously revised. 3 eyes, each angled differently from the others, each watching something the other two, were not wings that when spread displaced air across a full city block, wind. It moved with the patience of something that had seen this moment from the outside and found it exactly as anticipated. It did not attack. It said, "The architect finds you exquisite." Its voice was every voice at once, none quite matching any mouth it currently had. It told him what he already partially knew and what he had not yet fully understood, that his arrival had been catalogued in the first hour, that the warp disturbances he had generated since landing had been received not as a threat, but as sustenance. Every soul he had saved had generated a psychic event of precisely the kind the changer of ways required. Every act of mercy in a galaxy that treated mercy as a pathology had been received and converted. "You are not a hero in this story, alien," it said. "You are a harvest." Clark Kent hit it before it finished the next sentence. He drove the Lord of Change backward through the first warp rift. It tried to use as an exit and held it in real space by grip alone, because grip did not require the warp and could not be disrupted by its mechanics. The demon was enormous, and its strength was the accumulated sorcerous output of a greater demon at full manifestation. He held it against that anyway. He burned through its psychic matter structure with heat vision sustained and precise, targeting the dimensional anchoring that kept the demon's form coherent in real space. The Lord of Change writhed. It screamed in every voice at once. It attempted 3 separate exit vectors, and he blocked 2. The third one worked. The demon was gone. It would return. He knew that. It would rebuild its form in the warp and remanifest on a schedule the changer of ways had probably already set before he arrived at this system. He turned back to the battlefield. He saved everyone he could save right now, in this moment, with the tools available. Not because it solved the structural problem, not because it denied Tsiench anything in the long run. Because the guardsmen pinned behind the burning Lehman Russ on the regiment's eastern flank were dying right now, and the battle sisters holding the cathedral's last intact section were past the limit of what faith could sustain without reinforcement. And he was the reinforcement, and he was here, and the alternative was to stop, and he was not capable of stopping. The incursion ended 40 minutes after the Lord of Change was banished, not because Superman stopped it, because the Changer of Ways had decided it had served its purpose. The demonic tide withdrew into the warp with the abruptness of something recalled rather than defeated. Blue horrors dissolving mid-advance, flamers extinguishing before completing their firing arcs, the remaining warp rifts sealing from the inside out. The silence that followed was the silence of a room after something enormous and patient had finished listening, and found what it came to verify. The Astra Militarum regiment had lost 22% of its effectives. The Sisters of the Order of the Valorous Heart were at 41% strength. The primary hive's outer wall was breached in 6 places. He stood in the wreckage of the cathedral quarter, and the Xenos Inquisitor, who had come down from the frigate in the final 20 minutes of the engagement, found him there. She said nothing. She had stopped 3 Tsenkian incursions in her career. She had found no useful words for any of them from the outside or the inside. Then every Vox unit in the system activated simultaneously on a frequency the planet's communications network had not opened. The sound that came from them was a single sentence in a voice that was every voice at once, transmitted across every channel, received in every command post and Medicae station and shelter in the system at the same moment. "Thank you for the harvest." The Xenos Inquisitor looked at the figure standing in the wreckage of a battle he had won every moment of, and lost the overall engagement of, in a war that worked exactly like that, and said nothing. Because she was a professional, and she had learned that filling silence with words was the way you made yourself feel better, rather than the way you helped someone else carry what they were carrying. She had stopped 3 Tsenchian incursions in her career. None of them had ended with a demon saying thank you. The warp rift that opened above the ruins of the cathedral quarter did not fold, it tore. That was the difference. Tsinch's incursion had used structured, patient warp geometries, rifts that opened with the deliberate precision of a tool applied to a specific purpose. This was nothing like that. The sky above Vantis Secunda split from horizon to atmosphere in a line the color of old blood made luminous, and from it came heat that smelled of brass and copper and a century of accumulated slaughter. And the sound that preceded the arrival was not the shrieking wrongness of a Chinkian rift, but a roar that had no discernible source because it was coming from everywhere the tear touched simultaneously. Angron Demon, Primarch of the World Eaters, servant of the Blood God, dropped into real space with the mass of a small building and the temperament of something that had never once, not as a slave gladiator on the killing fields of Nuceria, not as a Primarch of the Great Crusade, not as the demonic avatar of Khorne's most beloved fury, arrived anywhere other than at full speed. The last time he came, it had taken Lion L. Johnson alone, wielding the Emperor's shield, a near invulnerable divine artifact that even Primarchs carried into battle at most once in their lives, to drive him back. Every account of that fight called it the hardest single engagement of the post-heresy era. The Lion had used every advantage he possessed. He had barely ended it. Angron did not assess the battlefield. He did not pause for the tactical situation or for the fact that the Tsenchian incursion had ended 40 minutes before he arrived. He saw the figure standing in the wreckage of the cathedral quarter, and he charged. The impact was felt 4 cities away. When the debris settled, Angron was standing over a crater 2 meters deep in the ferrocrete, and rising from the center of it, shaking rubble from his shoulders, was the alien, not the one who had made the crater. For the first time since landing in this galaxy, in any physical engagement, in any exchange of force, the figure in blue was not the one who had ended the opening exchange in control of it. He rose from the crater and looked up at 4 meters of Demon Primarch, the butcher's nails implanted in the bone behind Angron's eyes driving him at the permanent edge of what consciousness could sustain, Khorne's blessing swelling his physiology past what transhuman genetics alone could produce. 10,000 years of the warp's investment in the Blood God's most violent instrument made manifest. He looked at all of that. He did not step back. Angron hit him again. The fight that followed moved across what remained of the Hive District's outer zones with the momentum of two geological events competing for the same space. Angron's strikes carried warp energy the way his warband's weapons had carried it, but not the attenuated weapons-grade version. This was a Diamond Primarch's demonic physiology transmitting the Imperium's force directly, not catastrophically, not immediately. But with each exchange, with each blow that landed on the alien's arms and chest and shoulders, the cells that had shrugged off bolter fire and chain axe impacts and cyclonic torpedo yields registered a different kind of cost. He was not falling, he was not stopping, he was for the first time in this galaxy, working. He answered with everything the stellar charge could produce at full output. The difference was ceiling. Angron had routed legions. He had dueled greater daemons and broken them. He had pushed Lion L. Johnson, the greatest melee combatant among the loyalist Primarchs, to the absolute limit of what a near-invulnerable divine artifact could protect against. These were the heights of what a Daemon Primarch of Khorne, at full manifestation, could accomplish. Superman's physical ceiling, established across a lifetime of documented feats in a universe, this galaxy had no instruments to measure, involved moving planetary bodies and surviving stellar interiors. The two ceilings were not the same ceiling. In a fight measured in raw kinetic output, that difference was the entire fight. 4 minutes in, he stopped absorbing and started directing. He hit Angron at a velocity he had not used since his arrival on this world, the kind of velocity that required calculating in advance what lay between the starting point and the target, and what the passage would do to it. He drove the Demon Primarch across 3 city blocks in a single sustained push, released him, and hit him again before the impact from the first blow had fully resolved. He felt the ground beneath them respond in ways that the ground is not designed to respond to. In the tectonic monitoring stations of 3 adjacent continents, instruments that measured the structural behavior of the planet's crust registered an anomalous event whose seismic profile did not correspond to any entry in the Imperial Arsenal's classification system. He drove Angron upward, not into a wall, not through a building, upward through the lower atmosphere and through the stratosphere and toward the upper edge of the sky, where the ambient psychic resonance that sustained Angron's physical form on the surface of a battle-saturated world, attenuated in the thin air, where the warp tide he had ridden through the rift had no surface war to draw on anymore, where the blood god's attention remained, but the medium that concentrated it did not. At the edge of the atmosphere, he drove the Diamond Primarch back through his own rift. 8 minutes. Lion Ella Johnson alone, carrying the Emperor's shield and every advantage a Primarch could take into a fight, had ended the last engagement, and every account of it called that the hardest thing any loyalist warrior had done in the post-heresy age. Superman had done the same thing in 8 minutes. Without an artifact, without backup, without finding his limit, the rift sealed. As it closed, Angron's roar came back through the ceiling tier, coherent enough at its center to carry one word across the boundary between real space and the warp. Blood. In the Imperium, in the domain of the blood god, where a throne of skulls rises without a ceiling because no ceiling has ever been sufficient to contain it, something that was not a mind so much as the feeling of war given cosmic scale registered the tally of what the last day had produced. Guardsmen from the regiment that had held the line before the Tzeentchian daemons came, battle sisters who had stood at the cathedral wall past the point where standing was sustainable, Hive-world civilians caught in 3 overlapping engagements, 2 Astra Militarum regiments that had been fighting Angron before Superman arrived and had been reduced to remnants before he got there, Thousands dead across 6 battles and a day and a half of continuous war, all of it blood, regardless of who had shed it or the intention behind the shedding. The blood god did not register intention. Superman drove Angron back. Khorne was satisfied. He stood on the ruined world in the silence after the rift closed. Around him, arranged by the indifferent geometry of where people fall when they are killed, were the dead from 6 battles in a day and a half. Most of them had died before he arrived. Not all of them. He had won every fight. He was standing in the wreckage of every fight. The Xenos Inquisitor came down from the frigate 20 minutes later and found him there, looking at what remained of the outer district. She looked at the sealed sky where the rift had been, and at the ruined hive, and at the alien in the center of it. "Gilliman is waiting," she said. He did not look at her. He looked at the street in front of him, at the particular silence of a place where people had been and were not. "How do you keep doing this?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had a history in it. "Because the alternative is to stop," she said. "And we've established where that leads." He looked at her. Then the woman who had made 47 calls she could name by location and date and casualty count, who had ordered a strike on 2 million people and filed the report and kept working. She was not doing what he was doing or for the same reasons. But they were standing in the same rubble, and the answer they had each given when the question asked itself was the same answer, and neither of them said that out loud, because saying it out loud was not what either of them needed from the other right now. He looked at the sky where the rift had been. "Then we should go," he said. The Macrage's honor hung in high orbit like a decision that had already been made. 26 kilometers of polished ceramite and steel, a Gloriana-class vessel that had survived the Horus heresy and 10,000 years of continuous war and was now the largest active warship in Imperial service. It was the Lord Commander's flagship. It was the place where the Imperium's actual decisions were made, rather than the places where they were announced. It was, by any measure that applied to it, the most strategically significant vessel in the known galaxy. Superman's shuttle docked at its tertiary bay, which was the size of a cathedral and functioned as one. Trajan Valoris was waiting at the docking bay with a 4-man custodian escort, each of them armored in gold plate that made the finest space marine look like an early draft. The Xenos Inquisitor came as far as the deck plates and no further. Valoris looked at the alien with the flat professional assessment of a man who had spent his career distinguishing between threats and the other kind of threats, and did not speak. He walked toward the strategium. 3 corridors of silence. The corridors of the Macrage's honor were not built for silence. They were built for 8,000 crew and void-grade engines and the continuous logistical noise of the largest command vessel in the fleet. In those 3 corridors, the noise was present, and the silence was something that existed alongside it anyway. Then Valoris said, without breaking stride, "The Emperor's custodians have stood beside fewer than 6 Xenos whose threat assessment required a meeting rather than a directive. You are the first whose assessment required the Lord Commander personally. He did not say whether that was significant. He did not need to." They passed through 2 more corridors and a set of blast doors engraved with the Ultima symbol of the Ultramarines before Valoris opened the strategium. Inside, a data slate bearing the seal of Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call had been placed on the central table with a summary note in Call's characteristic notation. 17 points of biological anomaly, each referenced to primary research and secondary verification, and at the end of the summary, flagged in a different cipher from the rest, 4 words: "Golden Throne." "Requires conversation." Valoris took his position at the room's far wall and did not speak again. Gilliman entered from the opposite door. He was larger than a man and armored in the blue gold of the ultramarines, the Emperor's sword at his side and the hand of dominion on his left arm, and he carried the particular weight of a being who had been designed to believe in something and had been resurrected into a galaxy that had converted that something into the precise inverse of what it was supposed to be. He studied the alien across the table the way a strategist studies an unfamiliar position from the first move. He did not sit. "You stopped an exterminatus," he said. "You drove back Angron. You fought a Tintien incursion and won every battle and lost the day." Superman said, "Yes." Gilliman said, "Then you understand the problem." "Part of it," Superman said, "the part where winning every fight is not the same as winning." "I do not understand the part where the solution to that is what you are doing." "What am I doing?" "Burning people alive to keep people alive. Spending billions of lives to prevent billions of deaths. At some point, the math stops working, and what is left is just a machine that consumes people and calls it survival." Gimman was quiet for a moment. "I know." He said it without heat, without the performance of a man who has been caught in an argument he did not expect. He said it as a statement of established fact. "I have been awake for 3 years," he said, "and I have despised what this imperium is for every hour of every one of them. I know what the Emperor intended. I was there when he intended it. I watched him design a humanity that had no need of gods or superstition or the endless war that his own genius prolonged. He wanted what you want. He was 1,000 times more powerful than you and more intelligent, and he had been working toward it for 20,000 years before the heresy undid everything he built. He was right about everything that matters." He paused. "And for 10,000 years, he has been dying on a throne of gold in a room I cannot enter without his permission, worshipped as a god by the zealots who run his empire in his name and in defiance of everything he believed. That is what hope looks like when you are the most powerful being in the galaxy and you are right about everything and it does not matter. That is what good wins costs in this place." The strategium was very quiet. Superman said, "Then what do you fight for?" Gilliman looked at him. The Lord Commander of the Imperium, a man built to carry 10,000 years of civilizational failure on a frame designed for it, looked at the alien who had arrived from elsewhere carrying the same philosophy that had already failed here once at the highest possible level. "Because the alternative is to stop," he said, "and we have established where that leads. Silence, not empty. Full of the weight of 2 beings who had reached the same conclusion from opposite sides of a tragedy and found no comfort in the agreement. Neither won the argument, neither lost it. The world did not change because 2 people understood each other. The math did not change. The ruinous powers did not pause. The Emperor remained on his throne, and Cadia remained a ruin, and the Great Rift remained a wound across the face of the galaxy. Understanding was not a solution. It was, occasionally, the thing that made continuing possible." Belisarius Cole entered from the side door, which was his prerogative as an Archmagos Dominus, who had been old when the Imperium was young. He assessed the room, determined the primary conversation had reached a natural interval, and delivered the one line he had traveled here to deliver in person because Gimman had decided it warranted it. "Your biology processes stellar energy as a direct cellular input," Cole said. "The Golden Throne requires continuous energetic sustenance to maintain the Emperor's psychic function, and its mechanisms are degrading in ways the current compensatory supply cannot offset. The theoretical interface between your biology and the throne's input architecture is unverified. It would require your active participation. It might not work. Superman looked at Gearman. You want me to try to keep your emperor alive, he said. We want to know if you can, Call said. The trying comes after. Gilliman held Superman's look with the expression of a man who has spent 10,000 years watching the most important ideas in history fail and is not yet able to stop having them, because the alternative is to be the kind of man who has stopped having them, and that is the thing he despises most about the galaxy he woke up into. Valoris spoke from the far wall. One sentence, with the flat precision of a final operational assessment. He is not a threat to the throne. He is a resource it may need. He said it the way a custodian says everything that matters, as a military conclusion, not a compliment. Then he withdrew to his position by the door, because his assessment was complete and the rest of the conversation was not his function. Gilliman said, "He has never said that about anything that was not human." Superman said, "What does it mean?" Gearman said, "It means you're staying." Every astropath aboard the Macragge's Honor began screaming at the same moment. Not the controlled, regulated screaming of an astropathic transmission. That was a managed process, a trained mind reaching through the warp with precision and returning with a message. This was involuntary. 63 soul-bound psychers distributed across a vessel, 26 kilometers long, each reaching the warp in a different direction for a different purpose, each of them feeling simultaneously the same thing: the psychic weight of a fully charged alien solar being and the Lord Commander of the Imperium, and the specific emotional freight of the conversation that had just happened between them had pressed outward into the immaterium like a geological event, and the warp had received it. In the immaterium, the combined disturbance registered as something the Great Game had not previously encountered in this configuration. Not one god's operation, not one god's territory. All four of them noticing simultaneously, which was not a thing that happened unless what they were noticing was exceptional, in a way that exceeded the ordinary parameters of exceptional. The void shields of the Macragge's Honor flared to full power before the bridge crew could issue the order. The incursion came from 3 directions at once. Sentient sorcery opened the warp rifts, structured, geometrically precise tiers, the work of a prepared assault rather than an opportunistic one. Through them came Kornat berserkers, world eaters, warband elements, and their demonic kin, a combination that was operationally impossible by the ordinary logic of the Great Game, because Khorne despised sorcery. In all its forms and the blood god's servants, something had organized them anyway. Something that had observed enough of Superman's fights to understand that physical assault alone was insufficient, and that an incursion built instead around warp. Energy saturation, multiple sources, and simultaneous engagements producing cumulative damage at a rate his cellular repair could not maintain, while also operating at the speed the tactical situation required, was the correct approach. Whatever intelligence had planned, this had been watching and had learned. The system contained 6 inhabited worlds. The incursion struck 3 of them, the 2nd, the 5th, and the 7th. The Macragge's Honor and its escort fleet could commit full force to 1, partial force to 2, and cover none of them adequately, in the time the situation allowed. The nearest Imperial relief force was 4 hours out in real space. Superman stood at the Strategium viewport and heard 600 million heartbeats across the system. In the time it took the tactical display to finish updating, he could cover all 3. The calculation for doing it took longer than the decision. Covering 3 simultaneous theaters at the transit speed required, while sustaining the engagement intensity that each world situation demanded, while absorbing warp energy input from the sorcerers, The incursion had positioned specifically to target him. While maintaining the solar charge, that was the only thing keeping his cellular repair ahead of the accumulating damage. The numbers at the end of that calculation did not recommend the course of action. They said the cost was real and the margin was narrow and the outcome was not safe. He went anyway, not because the math worked out in his favor, because 3 worlds of people were the reason the math existed. He hit the second world first. A cornate breakthrough at the Planetary Defense Command World Eaters Berserkers, already through the inner perimeter and working toward the command center, where 3,000 guardsmen were making their last coordinated stand behind doors that would not hold. He broke the assault in under 2 minutes. He felt the warp blasts land while he worked. 3 Tsientian sorcerers positioned at the perimeter of the coordinated advance, not attacking the planetary defense structure, targeting him specifically. The blasts hit his chest and arms and left marks that the solar radiation overhead began to close immediately, and closed more slowly than the ones on Secundus had closed. He moved to the 5th world without stopping. A Tzinkian reality unraveling event in the cathedral quarter of the primary hive. The kind of structured psychic assault that dissolved the boundary between real space and the imperium in a widening circle, pulling the geometry of the real into correspondence with the geometry of the warp, which was the geometry of hunger given architectural form. 6 city blocks already gone when he arrived. He sealed it with heat vision at intensities he had not used since the cyclonic torpedo above Hector Minoris, burning the rifts closed from the inside, while the sorcerers working the perimeter hit his back with everything they had. He counted the impacts, he stopped counting at 11, and finished the work. The 7th world was the kill shot. A Lord of Change manifesting over a population center of 12 million people. Not an opportunistic manifestation, but a prepared one. A greater demon that had been building its anchor to real space from the moment the first rift opened, structurally embedded in ways that the previous Lord of Change had not been. He hit it at the velocity he had used against Angron. It held. It held longer than the previous one had, and the ring of Tzinkian sorcerers positioned around the manifestation site, hit him with concentrated warp blasts from every angle while he worked, and what they had was significant. He took it. He kept driving. He burned the Lord of Change out of real space with everything the stellar charge could produce, and then continued spending past what the stellar charge could immediately replace. He landed in the ruins of the cathedral district. He did not immediately get up. This had not happened before. He had been knocked into craters by Angron. He had absorbed cyclonic torpedo yields and a day and a half of concentrated demonic assault, and had gotten up from all of it with the efficiency of a system that had been built to recover at speed. He got up from this too, but there was a moment, flat on the rubble, where the system's yellow star worked on his cells, and he let it, and the moment stretched in a way that no previous moment of its kind in this galaxy had stretched, and the cost of the last several hours pressed down with the full weight of what it was. He was on his feet when the Thunderhawk came down 20 minutes later. Gilliman descended the ramp with 2 custodian escorts. He surveyed what was left of the cathedral district, 6 blocks of rubble, where the reality unraveling had been sealed at its edge, the scorch marks of a greater diamond's banishment at the center, and the alien standing in the middle of it with the last of 3 simultaneous warp damage patterns fading from his arms. Gilliman looked at all of it. He said nothing for a long time. The 3 worlds were intact. 600 million people were alive who would not have been alive if the choice had gone the other way. The incursion had failed. By every operational metric the Imperium possessed, Khorne had received the blood of the battle regardless. Tzeentch had received whatever 600 million saved lives generated in the imperium. The Great Game had fed from every moment of what had just happened, including the moments that felt most like victories. That was the structure of the place. That was what it was and would keep being. Guilliman stood in the ruins of the cathedral and said, once a thing he had not said before, and would not say again in this form. I understand now why the Emperor believed what he believed. Before he became what he became, he was something like you. He did not elaborate. He did not specify which part of it he meant, or what the Emperor had been before the throne, and the 10 millennia of dying had converted him into a symbol of everything he had not intended. He let the statement carry what it carried and left it standing. Superman said, was it enough? Guilliman said, number but it mattered from Robert Guilliman in the 41st millennium that was as close to hope as this galaxy offered. Not a promise, not an argument, not a comfort, a precise statement about the value of things that were not sufficient and mattered anyway, delivered by a man who had been carrying that particular truth for 10,000 years and had not put it down. Superman stood in the ruins and looked at where the rift had been. He did not put it down either. Belisarius Cawl delivered the return analysis in a quiet room on the Macragge's honor that had been cleared of staff for the occasion, with the specific consideration of someone who understood, after 10,000 years of study, that some information was best received without an audience. The dimensional fracture that had brought Superman here was closed. Cawl had reconstructed its signature from the astropathic records of the unyielding contrition and 3 other monitoring vessels, and the reconstruction was complete enough to be conclusive. The fracture had sealed behind its transit event in the way of a wound closing over a foreign object. The mechanism of inter-universal transit, insofar as Cawl had been able to theorize one, operated entirely outside the Mechanicus's theoretical framework for warp navigation, which moved between locations within this reality. There was no known path back. Cawl, who had spent 10,000 years finding paths that the Imperium's collective intelligence had concluded did not exist, was telling him that this was not one of those. He received this information in the quiet room, with the careful attention he gave to all information that mattered. He was quiet for approximately 90 seconds. Then he asked what needed doing. Cawl, who had observed alien cognition across 67 distinct xenotypes in 10,000 years of study, filed this response under a category he had not previously needed and titled Most Alien Thing Encountered. Not the 90 seconds of silence. The thing that came after it. The conversation with Guilliman happened in the Strategium the following morning, and it was the kind of conversation that was over before it technically began. Guilliman's offer. Classification as a sanctioned Xenos asset, a designation that had existed 3 times in Imperial history and had been deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved each time. Superman would operate under inquisitorial oversight and provide situation reports to the Lord Commander's office. In exchange, the Imperium would extend its formal non-hostility to his operations. Superman's counter. He did not operate under anyone. He went where the need was worst, and did what he judged right, and he would not commit exterminatus on anyone's authority, and would not be used as a weapon, and would not stop helping people, because a report was overdue. If the Imperium happened to benefit from those activities, fine. If it did not, that was also the situation. He filed the paperwork designating Superman a sanctioned Xenos asset in a manner that embedded the designation inside 3 separate operational directives with different effective dates, cross-referenced a classification review to a committee, and structured the inquisitorial oversight requirement as a notification protocol rather than a permission structure. The Inquisition would find and formally contest the filing in 17 months. They would not win the contest because Guilliman had been administering legal frameworks for 10,000 years and knew exactly which load-bearing walls to remove from an argument before the other side arrived. The Golden Throne attempt was not spoken about directly, which was Call's preference and Guilliman's practice. Under Call's supervision, Superman had approached the throne's outer interface architecture during a scheduled maintenance window. The results were inconclusive in the specific way that preliminary findings are inconclusive when the theory is correct, but the methodology requires development. There was a compatibility, the stellar energy biology registering against the throne's input mechanisms in ways that Call's instruments could measure and could not yet interpret. But the interface between the two systems was wrong, in ways that months of additional work might resolve or might not. The Emperor's psychic presence, vast and passive, and distributed across the full extent of the palace's sanctified architecture, had registered something during the 11 minutes of contact. What it registered, no one could say. Call filed it as preliminary positive contact. He began working on the methodology. Superman did not file it in any formal sense. He carried it in the way he carried things that mattered, without resolution. The man on the throne had believed something, and that belief had cost him everything he had, and he had not stopped believing it before the cost was extracted. Whatever the 11 minutes of contact had been, he had felt the scale of that, and it was the largest thing he had felt in this galaxy, and he did not put it down. The Xenos Inquisitor filed her final report on the subject through official Ordo Xenos channels, with 17 copies routed to 17 inquisitorial lords, who would argue about it for years. The classification section read, "No existing category applies." The recommendation section read, "No action." The rationale section read, "The entity has operated continuously in the galaxy's interest by every operational metric the Ordo Xenos possesses, has demonstrated consistent non-hostility to Imperial personnel and assets, and poses no threat that exceeds the demonstrated benefit of its continued uncontrolled operation." She closed the report with a note she knew would outlast the argument about the classification. "Whatever it is on our side. Whether that is a comfort or a warning depends on what we deserve." Then she sealed the report and moved on to the next thing, because that was what she did, and it was what she had always done. And the fact that she had spent the last several weeks operating alongside something she had no category for had not changed the operational rhythm that made her good at her job. She had her answer. She would not pretend it was a comfortable one. Superman was alone in the system's upper atmosphere when the next crisis found him, in the full, unfiltered light of the yellow star, with his cells charged to the limit the star could sustain. He ran an inventory, in the way he ran all inventories carefully, without looking away from what was in it, every person he had saved since the fracture. The guardsmen on Desalium Prime's siege line, the civilians who came out of the shelters on Secundus, the 400 million on Hector Minoris, less 2 million in one district, less the compromise that district represented. Everyone who had been alive at the end of a battle and not at the start of one, the Lord of Change's parting message on every vox in the system. Guilliman's face when he said it mattered. He thought about the glyph on his chest. The symbol that was not a letter, not in any language this galaxy spoke, but that a child on Secundus had reached out and touched as if it meant something, and that had looked the same to that child as it looked to everyone who had ever looked at it where he came from. He thought about what it meant, whether it meant the same thing here. He decided it did. The galaxy did not agree. The warp did not agree. the ruinous powers cataloguing his presence as a resource, did not agree. The great rift, the wound across the sky that Abaddon had torn open and that no victory Superman could achieve, would close, did not agree. The Golden Throne, failing by increments in a room he had briefly touched, did not agree. None of them agreed, and all of them would keep being exactly what they were, regardless of what he decided. He was going to be here anyway. He heard it before anyone on the ground had a sensor reading. A small Astra Militarum reconnaissance unit on the system's fourth moon, 6 Taurox carriers and 42 guardsmen, pinned behind a ridgeline by an Orc advanced scouting force that had come down from a crashed rock 3 weeks ago. Not an extinction-scale threat, not a demonic incursion. 42 people, pinned behind a ridge on a moon that was not anyone's strategic priority, who were alive right now and would continue to be alive, or not, depending on the next hour. He was moving before the unit's Vox officer finished composing the distress call. In this galaxy, that was what hope looked like. Not a feeling, not a comfort. An action taken before anyone asked for it, because the need was real and the capacity was present, and the alternative was to stop. He had established where that led. In the imperium, where geometry is ambition and time is a suggestion rather than a constraint, and the distance between one thought and its consequence has always been the only distance that matters, the changer of ways catalogued what Superman's presence in the galaxy had generated since the dimensional fracture deposited him on a Hive-World siege line. Warp events consistent with hope. Warp events consistent with mercy. Warp events consistent with the specific emotional signature of a being who continued to believe, with an absoluteness the architect of fate found technically remarkable, that things could be better than they were, despite every available datum suggesting otherwise. The disturbance was ongoing. It was not diminishing. There was no mechanism by which it would diminish. As long as the being generating it continued to do what it was doing, which, by all available evidence, it would continue to do indefinitely. The changer of ways did not plan an immediate counter. Plans were already in motion. They had been in motion since before the dimensional fracture opened, because Tzeentch's plans existed in a relationship with time that made the distinction between already in motion and not yet initiated functionally meaningless. Every piece that had moved in the galaxy in the last standard century had been a preparation for several things simultaneously, and the alien's arrival was among the several. The architect had catalogued it in the first hour. The adjustments to the plans already in motion had taken approximately 11 seconds. The changer of ways concluded, across whatever approximation of cognition the most Byzantine mind in the Imperium could be said to engage in, that this was the most interesting development the galaxy had produced in several centuries. It filed the conclusion alongside 10,000 other ongoing conclusions and moved to the next variable, because there were always 10,000 other ongoing conclusions, and the most interesting one was never the only one that required attention. In another quarter of the Imperium, on a throne of skulls that rose without ceiling or floor, because the blood god had never had need of either, something that was not a mind, so much as the feeling of war given cosmic scale, registered the tally. Not Superman's kills. He had gone to considerable effort not to kill, and the effort was noted with the specific contempt that the blood god reserved for fighting styles he found philosophically inadequate. But the blood shed in the chaos warbands he had dispersed, in the incursions he had fought, in the cities caught in the crossfire of engagements that would not have occurred in those locations or at that intensity without his presence as the point of convergence. Thousands of bodies across a dozen worlds. Their blood added to the tally in the only accounting system the blood god maintained. Blood was blood. The blood god did not distinguish between the hand that shed it and the reason it was shed, because in the blood god's domain, those distinctions had never been relevant. The alien's mercy-polluted, honorless fighting style, its refusal to take heads, its habit of pulling wounded from rubble rather than leaving them where they fell, these were contemptible. The blood that accumulated in its wake, regardless of those habits, was not. The blood god found this new being useful after a fashion, and logged the finding alongside its other satisfactions, of which there were always sufficient numbers in a galaxy that had been at war for 10,000 years without interruption. Far from the segmentum sanctus, in the cold outer dark where hive fleet tendrils probed the galaxy's edge in the patient, methodical way of a hunger that had been crossing the intergalactic void for longer than the imperium of man had existed, the Swarmlord paused in its latest rebirth. The hive mind had registered an anomaly, a biological signature, burning with stellar energy, present on multiple worlds across multiple systems, generating heat in spectra that the Tyranid biomass catalogues had no classification for, active and mobile, and in the consistent habit of destroying things the hive mind had earmarked for eventual absorption. The signature's source had no entry in any catalogue the hive mind possessed. It was building one with the patient thoroughness the hive mind applied to any biological anomaly it had decided to eventually understand and consume. The Swarmlord, reforming in the cold between stars, turned the hive mind's attention across light years toward the burning signature. It was novel. Novel things in the hive mind's experience were novel for a limited time. In the deepest sanctum of the imperial palace on Terra, in the room where the emperor of mankind had sat for 10,000 years and continued sitting, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers daily and the failing infrastructure of a throne that had been in continuous operation, something shifted in the psychic output of the Golden Throne's mechanisms. It was not a movement, he could not move. It was not a signal in any form that instruments had been able to decode reliably for millennia. It was a change in the quality of what the throne produced. For a period of 11 minutes, during which Belisarius' calls, most sensitive instruments, registered an anomalous energy input consistent with a stellar biology interface attempt at the throne's outer architecture, the Astronomican's output increased by a fractional but measurable margin. Small enough that the navigator core would not register a change in the beacon's reliability in their calculations. Large enough that instruments calibrated specifically to measure the throne's baseline output would record a statistically significant deviation. For 11 minutes, the beacon burned slightly brighter than it had burned in 10,000 years. Then it returned to baseline. Call recorded the data with the care he applied to all preliminary findings that warranted development rather than publication. He did not publish it. Publishing preliminary data without a reproducible methodology and a defensible interface model would accomplish nothing except generating arguments he did not have the attention to spare. He kept the recording and returned to the methodology, which was the hardest problem he had attempted in 10,000 years, and therefore the one he was most interested in solving. He had solved harder problems. He had simply required more time, high in orbit, above a small hive world, with no strategic significance in any imperial assessment currently active. A figure in a cape that had seen considerably better days hung in the starlight. His cells were charged. The system's yellow star had done what yellow stars do, and the stellar charge was at the limit the star could sustain, and the accumulated warp damage marks from the three-world engagement were closed. He was whole. His hearing was cataloguing 1,000 crises across 100 systems. He could not solve all of them. He could not fix this galaxy. He could not punch the warp out of existence or exhaust the hive mind's patience, or undo what Abaddon had started when he destroyed Cadia and tore the sky of the galaxy open. He knew that now the way he knew his own heartbeat. He had known it since the Lord of Change said what it said, and he had hit it mid-sentence anyway, and, knowing it had not changed what he did, about any of it, he would be here when the next threat came, because in this galaxy it always came. Because the great rift was open, and the throne was failing, and the galaxy's 3 extinction-level threats were each permanently immune to permanent defeat. Because the ruinous powers were not an army to break, but the galaxy looking at itself, and you could not resolve that by force. And he was not going to stop trying to resolve it by everything else. He had nowhere else to be. And for the first time since the fracture dropped him into this burning dark, nowhere else to be felt, less like a sentence and more like a choice. The difference between those two things was not in the situation. It had never been in the situation. It was in whether the being inside the situation decided what the situation meant. He had decided. The glyph on his chest meant what it had always meant. The galaxy did not agree. He was going to be here anyway. All right, before you go anywhere, drop a comment right now. Which character needs to land somewhere impossible next? And which universe deserves to have absolutely no idea what is coming for it? I want names. I want crossovers. Drop them below, because I genuinely read every single one. And the comment section for this one is going to be something. Also, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your location below. I love seeing where this reaches. If you want to be in the room when the next one drops, the subscribe button is right there, and it is free, and hitting it takes about as long as it took Superman to dismantle 40 World Eaters. And if this one hit the way I hoped it did, the like costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that something worth watching just happened here. I'll see